Have you ever felt invisible, like you were just background noise in someone else's story? Maybe you've been the one who kept things running, who made sure everyone else was fed, safe, and ready, while nobody ever bothered to learn your name. If you've ever wondered whether you could make a difference, even when the world says you're just the cook, this story is for you. And if you know someone working behind the scenes, share this with them, because sometimes the least likely person is the one who saves everyone. The war had a way of making everyone feel small, but even Sereda was used to being overlooked. He wasn't a soldier, not really. He wore the uniform, but his hands were calloused from chopping onions, not from firing rifles. His world was the mess tent, the battered field kitchen, and the battered pots that clanged with every step. He'd grown up in a peasant family, learned to cook from his mother, and trained at the Donetsk food training center before being drafted into the Red Army. They sent him to the 91st Tank Regiment, not for his aim, but for his borscht. He fed the tank crews, kept them laughing, and made sure there was always something hot when the wind howled through the camp. Most days, the soldiers barely noticed him. They'd shout for more bread, joke about his stew, and tease him for never carrying a weapon. Even just smiled, stirred his pots, and listened. He knew every rumor, every fear, every hope that passed through the mess line. He knew who missed home, who was scared, who was pretending not to be. But he also knew the war was getting closer. The officers whispered about German tanks moving through the forests. The men joked about one last hot meal, but their eyes were worried. One gray morning, Ivan was alone by the field kitchen, chopping carrots for the midday stew. The camp was quiet, too quiet. He glanced up, squinting into the mist, and saw a shape moving at the tree line. At first, he thought it was a supply truck. Then he saw the Iron Cross painted on the side. A German tank moving fast, its gun already swinging toward the camp. Ivan's heart pounded. He ducked behind the kitchen, but the tank fired blindly, the shell tearing through his pots and sending food flying. The stew he'd spent hours making splattered across the mud. Something inside Ivan snapped, not with fear, but with a wild, furious resolve. He grabbed the only weapon he had, a heavy iron axe used for splitting firewood. The tank rumbled closer, its engine growling. Ivan ran not away, but straight at the steel beast. He leapt onto the tank, swinging the axe with all his strength. The metal rang with every blow. Inside, the German crew panicked, firing blindly through the machine gun port. Ivan dodged, slammed the axe down again and again, bending the barrel, denting the hatch. He tore off his apron and sleeves, stuffing them into the tank's periscopes and viewports, blinding the crew. The tank lurched, trying to shake him off, but Ivan clung tight, yelling and banging on the armor. He wanted them to think the whole Red Army was upon them. He jumped down, grabbed a bundle of straw, and set it alight, shoving it into the tank's wheels. Smoke poured inside. Ivan shouted in broken German, "Bring anti-tank grenades." Now, the crew, terrified, believed they were surrounded. Inside, the Germans coughed and cried out, convinced they were doomed. Finally, the hatch burst open. 4 soldiers tumbled out, hands raised, dropping their weapons. Ivan pointed a captured rifle at them, ordering them to tie each other up. When the dust settled, the Germans turned and realized the truth. Their enemy was not a squad, not a platoon, just one furious, flour-dusted cook. Ivan burst out laughing, and the tension broke. Minutes later, Soviet soldiers returned, weapons drawn, expecting an enemy attack. They dropped to the ground, ready to fight until they saw Ivan standing atop the tank, waving his axe and shouting, "Come on, brothers! Food is ready." The camp was stunned. One cook, alone, had captured a tank and 4 enemy soldiers without firing a single bullet. And, as the men soon discovered, he'd even managed to keep dinner warm. That day, Ivan Sereda became a legend. But for him, it was just another day in the kitchen doing what needed to be done, because nobody else would. He had no idea that his courage would soon be tested again, and that the fate of the entire outpost would rest in the hands of the man everyone thought was just a cook. The legend of Ivan Sereda spread through the outpost like wildfire. By nightfall, every soldier in the 91st Tank Regiment had heard how the cook, armed with nothing but an axe and a bag of kitchen tricks, had captured a German tank and 4 prisoners. Some told the story with laughter, others with awe, and a few with a hint of envy. But for Ivan, the attention was uncomfortable. He was used to being invisible, not a hero. He spent the evening cleaning what was left of his kitchen, salvaging pots from the mud, and apologizing to the quartermaster for the loss of the midday stew. The soldiers brought him gifts, extra rations, a battered harmonica, even a bottle of vodka. Ivan accepted them with a shy smile, but his mind was elsewhere. That night, as the men gathered around the campfire, Ivan sat quietly at the edge of the circle. He listened to the stories, the jokes, the whispered fears. The Germans were close, maybe closer than anyone wanted to admit. The officers argued in low voices about the state of the defenses. The sentries doubled their watch. Ivan couldn't sleep. He walked the perimeter, the cold air biting through his thin coat. He thought about his mother, about home, about the strange twist of fate that had made him the outpost's unlikely defender. The next morning, the mood in camp was tense. Patrols returned with reports of enemy movement in the woods. The radio crackled with warnings from neighboring units. Prepare for attack. Enemy armor sighted to the north. Ivan stirred his morning porridge, watching the officers huddle over their maps. He saw the worry in their eyes, the way their hands shook as they lit cigarettes. The outpost was isolated, low on ammunition, and short on experienced soldiers. Many of the men were new recruits, farm boys, and students, barely trained out. As the sun climbed higher, Ivan noticed something odd. The German prisoners he'd captured were unusually quiet, their eyes darting to the tree line. One of them, a young man with a scar across his cheek, whispered to the others in rapid German. Ivan didn't understand the words, but he recognized fear. He approached Lieutenant Sokolov, the officer in charge of the prisoners. "Something's wrong," Ivan said quietly. "They're expecting something." Sokolov frowned. "What do? You mean?" Ivan shrugged. "They're scared. Not of us, of what's coming." Sokolov nodded, his face grim. "We'll double the guard." By midday, the tension was a living thing. The wind carried the distant rumble of engines, the faint crackle of gunfire. Ivan worked in the kitchen, but his mind was on the perimeter. He watched the sentries, the way they scanned the woods, fingers tight on their rifles. Suddenly, a shout rang out. Movement in the trees. The camp exploded into action. Officers barked orders, soldiers scrambled for weapons, and the radio sputtered with frantic calls for reinforcements. Ivan ducked behind his stove, heart pounding. The first shells landed in the clearing, sending dirt and debris flying. German infantry surged from the trees, rifles blazing. The outpost defenders fired back, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Ivan watched in horror as the enemy pressed closer, bullets tearing through tents and splintering crates. The kitchen was hit, pots and pans flying in all directions. Ivan crawled for cover, clutching his axe. He saw Sokolov rallying the men, shouting for them to hold the line. The German prisoners huddled in the mud, eyes wide with terror. The battle raged for what felt like hours. The defenders fell back, inch by inch, toward the center of the camp. Ivan found himself in the thick of it, dragging wounded men to safety, using his apron as a bandage, his axe as a weapon when the enemy broke through the first line. At one point, a German soldier burst into the kitchen, rifle raised. Ivan didn't think. He swung the axe, knocking the weapon aside, then tackled the man to the ground. They grappled in the mud, Ivan's strength born of desperation. He managed to subdue the soldier, tying his hands with a strip of canvas all around him. Chaos reigned. The defenders were running low on ammunition. The radio operator was hit, and the Germans were closing in. Ivan crawled to the radio, blood on his hands, and tried to make contact with the nearest unit. Static. He remembered the harmonica one of the soldiers had given him, an old trick from his childhood. He blew a series of notes, a coded signal for help, hoping someone would hear. Minutes later, a distant reply, a faint echo of the same melody. Reinforcements were on the way, but the outpost had to hold. Ivan rallied the cooks, the mechanics, even the wounded. They built barricades from crates and sandbags, hurled pots and pans at the enemy, and fought with whatever they could find. The kitchen became a fortress, the mess tent a last stand. Sokolov, wounded but unbowed, found Ivan in the chaos. "We can't hold much longer," he gasped. "If you have any ideas, now's the time." Ivan looked around, the burning tents, the wounded men, the enemy closing in. He saw a stack of flour sacks, a barrel of cooking oil, and a box of matches. He grinned. "We'll give them a feast they'll never forget." He and the cooks doused the approach with oil, scattered flour into the air, and set it alight as the Germans charged. A wall of fire and smoke erupted, blinding the attackers and forcing them back. The defenders rallied, pushing the enemy out of the camp, just as the sound of Soviet reinforcements echoed through the woods. The Germans retreated, leaving behind their wounded and their pride. When the smoke cleared, the outpost was battered but standing. Ivan, covered in flour and soot, stood atop the kitchen steps, axe in hand, grinning like a madman. The soldiers cheered. Sokolov embraced him, tears in his eyes. "You saved us, Ivan. You saved us all." Ivan just laughed. "I'm only the cook." But everyone knew the truth. The man who had always been invisible had become the outpost's greatest hero. And as the sun set over the battered camp, Ivan realized that sometimes the ones who feed the army are the ones who save it. The outpost was battered, but alive. As dusk fell and the last echoes of gunfire faded into the forest, even Sereda found himself at the center of a celebration he never wanted. Soldiers limped through the mud, slapping him on the back, raising battered tin cups in his honor. Someone had found a battered accordion, and soon the mess tent was filled with music, laughter, and the wild, relieved tears of men who had seen death and lived to tell the tale. Ivan tried to slip away, but Sokolov caught his arm. "No, Ivan. Tonight, you sit with us. Tonight, you are not just the cook. You are the hero." Ivan blushed, unused to praise. He sat at the head of the long table, his apron still streaked with blood and flour, and listened as the men recounted the day's battle. Each telling grew wilder. Ivan had fought off a dozen Germans with his bare hands. Ivan had single-handedly driven the tank back into the woods. Ivan had summoned the reinforcements with a song. Ivan laughed along, but inside he felt a strange emptiness. He had done what needed to be done, but the cost was heavy. Too many wounded, too many friends gone. The next morning, the camp was a hive of activity. Medics tended to the wounded, mechanics patched up battered vehicles, and the engineers worked to repair the radio. Ivan and his cook salvaged what they could from the ruined kitchen, boiling water for tea and making a thin gruel from the last. Of the oats dot, he visited the wounded, bringing them broth and quiet words. Some were too hurt to speak, but they squeezed his hand in gratitude. He sat with the radio operator, who had taken a bullet in the shoulder. "You saved us, Ivan," the young man whispered. "Your song brought help." Ivan shook his head. "We all did our part. You held the line." Word of Ivan's deeds spread beyond the outpost. Couriers arrived from neighboring units, bringing letters of thanks and small gifts, a loaf of black bread, a jar of honey, a medal hastily pinned to a scrap of cloth. One letter, written in a careful hand, came from a general at headquarters. Your courage is an inspiration to us all. The Red Army is proud to have you in its ranks. Ivan tucked the letter into his pocket, unsure what to make of it. He was still just a cook after all. But the war would not let him return to obscurity. The Outpost victory was short-lived. Scouts reported that the enemy was regrouping, massing for another assault. The officers met late into the night, arguing over how to defend the battered camp. Sokolov found Ivan by the fire, staring into the flames. We're low on ammunition, Ivan. Half the men are wounded. If the Germans come again, I don't know. If we can hold, Ivan nodded, thinking. We have to make them think we're stronger than we are. Sokolov raised an eyebrow. How? Ivan grinned. With food. Or rather, with the smell of it. He explained his plan. Build extra fires. Boil water with whatever scraps they had, potatoes, cabbage, even old boots if need be. Let the smoke and scent drift into the woods. Make the enemy believe the camp was full, well-fed, ready for a fight. Sokolov laughed, clapping Ivan on the back. You're a genius, Ivan. A mad genius. That night, Ivan and his cooks worked in secret. They built fires along the perimeter, hung empty pots over the flames, and filled the air with the rich, savory scent of stew. They sang songs, banged on pots, and made as much noise as a regiment twice their size. The enemy scouts watched from the trees, counting the fires, listening to the laughter. They reported back to their commanders. The Russians are strong. Reinforcements must have arrived. The next morning, the attack never came. The Germans withdrew, convinced they faced a fresh division. The men cheered Ivan, hoisting him onto their shoulders. Our cook fooled the enemy. Our cook saved the day. Ivan laughed, but inside he felt the exhaustion of days without sleep. The ache of wounds old and new. That evening, Ivan sat by the fire, writing a letter to his mother. He told her about the battle, the fire, the ruse. He left out the fear, the blood, the nightmares. He promised her he would come home, that he would keep cooking, keep fighting, keep believing. He tucked the letter into his coat, staring at the stars. He wondered if she would ever read it. A week later, a convoy arrived at the outpost, fresh troops, supplies, a new commander. Major Petrov was young, sharp-eyed, and full of questions. He called Ivan to his tent. I've heard stories. About you, Sereda. Is it true you captured a tank with an axe? Ivan shrugged, embarrassed. I did what I had to do, sir. Petrov smiled. Well, we need more men like you. The enemy is planning something big. I want you to help train the new recruits. Ivan blinked. Me? I'm just the cook. Petrov shook his head. You're a survivor. And right now, that's what we need. Ivan found himself leading drills, teaching the new soldiers how to move quietly, how to use whatever was at hand as a weapon, how to keep their spirits up with a song or a story. He showed them how to make soup from almost nothing, how to keep a fire burning in the rain, how to listen for the enemy in the silence. The recruits listened, laughed, and learned. Some called him Comrade Cook, others even the Terrible. Ivan took it all in stride, proud to see them grow stronger, braver, more ready for what was coming. For a few days, the outpost was almost peaceful. The men played cards, sang songs, and told wild stories of Ivan's exploits. The kitchen was rebuilt, the mess tent filled with laughter and the smell of fresh bread. But Ivan knew the peace would not last. He saw it in the way the officers studied their maps and the way the scouts returned from the woods with haunted eyes. One night, as Ivan walked the perimeter, he heard the distant rumble of engines. He knew deep in his bones that the enemy was coming. He returned to the kitchen, sharpened his axe, and prepared a pot of stew. Whatever happened next, He was ready. He was no longer just the cook. He was the heart of the outpost. And when the next attack came, Ivan Sereda would be at the front, apron, axe, and all. The warning came at dawn, carried on the cold wind and the frantic footsteps of a breathless scout. They're coming. Hundreds of them. Tanks, trucks, infantry, everything. The outpost snapped awake. Orders were shouted. Boots pounded. The mud, and every man, from the youngest recruit to the oldest sergeant, scrambled to their posts. Even Sereda, the cook who had become a legend, was already up. He'd been awake for hours, unable to sleep, his mind haunted by the uneasy quiet of the night. He'd felt the storm coming, and now it was here. Major Petrov called his officers together in the command tent. The news was grim. The enemy had massed a force at least 3 times their size. Their own reinforcements were days away, the radio unreliable, and ammunition was running low. "We hold as long as we can," Petrov said, his voice steady. "We make them pay for every inch." Ivan stood at the edge of the tent, apron tied over his uniform, axe in hand. Petrov caught his eye and nodded. "Sereda, you know this camp better than anyone. I want you on the inner line. If they break through, you rally the wounded and the cooks. Hold the kitchen. It's our last fallback." Ivan nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He gathered his cooks and the mechanics, men who had never fired a shot in anger, and showed them how to barricade the mess. Tent, how to use boiling water and kitchen knives as weapons, how to keep their heads when the shooting started. He checked on the wounded, brought them bread and tea, whispered words of encouragement. "We'll get through this," he promised, even as he wondered if it was true. The attack began with a thunder of artillery. Shells screamed overhead, tearing through tents and trenches, sending men diving for cover. The ground shook, the air filled with smoke and dust. Then the tanks came, lumbering through the trees, guns blazing. Infantry followed, shouting in guttural German, firing into the chaos. The outpost defenders fought back with everything they had. Machine guns rattled, mortar thumped, rifles cracked. The first wave was met with a wall of fire, and Steel. Ivan and his kitchen brigade waited in the mess tent, hearts pounding. The wounded clutched their rifles, the cooks gripped axes and ladles. Ivan kept them calm, telling stories, making them laugh. Even as the battle raged closer, a shell hit the kitchen, blowing out a wall. Ivan was thrown to the ground, ears ringing. He pulled himself up, checked his men, no one dead, a few bleeding but alive. He looked outside. The enemy was at the wire. Major Petrov's voice crackled over the field phone. "They're breaking through on the west. Fall back to the inner line." Ivan rallied his men. They dragged the wounded into the kitchen, overturned tables for barricades, and filled pots with boiling water. The first German soldiers burst through the door. Rifles raised. Ivan met them with a roar, swinging his axe. The cooks hurled boiling water, knives, anything they could grab. The Germans, expecting an easy victory, were stunned by the ferocity of the defense. For an hour, the mess tent became a fortress. Ivan fought like a man possessed, his apron stained with blood and broth. He moved from man to man, patching wounds, shouting encouragement, never letting anyone give in to fear. Outside, the defenders regrouped and counterattacked, driving the enemy back from the kitchen. The ground was littered with bodies, the air thick with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. As the day wore on, the situation grew dire. Ammunition was almost gone. The wounded outnumbered the healthy, and the enemy was massing for a final assault. Petrov called Ivan to the command post. "We can't hold much longer. If they break through, they'll slaughter everyone." Ivan thought for a moment, then remembered the old cellar beneath the kitchen, a relic from before the war, stocked with barrels and crates. "We can hide the wounded there," he said. "And if we collapse the entrance, it'll buy us time." Petrov agreed. Ivan and his cooks worked quickly, carrying the wounded down into the cellar, stacking crates to block the door. He left 2 cooks with them, promising to return. As the enemy launched their final assault, Ivan and the last defenders made their stand in the ruined kitchen. They fought with everything they had: axes, knives, broken rifles. Even fists thought the Germans stormed the mess tent, overwhelming the defenders. Ivan was knocked to the ground, his axe wrenched from his hand. He saw Petrov fall, saw his friends dragged away. A German officer stood over Ivan, pistol raised. "Surrender, cook. It's over." Ivan looked up, blood in his eyes. "Not yet." He lunged, grabbing a pot of boiling oil, and hurled it at the officer. The man screamed, dropping his pistol. Ivan tackled him, wrestling for the weapon. A shot rang out. The officer slumped, and Ivan staggered to his feet, gun in hand. He looked around. The kitchen was a ruin, the defenders dead or captured. But the cellar was still hidden, the wounded safe for now. Night fell. The enemy searched the camp, but the cellar remained undiscovered. Ivan, wounded and exhausted, crawled through the shadows, bringing water and bread to the hidden men. He listened to the Germans talk, frustrated, angry, convinced there were more Russians hiding somewhere. He spread rumors, whispered through cracks in the walls, making the enemy believe the outpost was still full of defenders. For 2 days, Ivan kept the secret, keeping hope alive. On the 3rd morning, the sound of distant artillery echoed through the woods. Soviet reinforcements, drawn by Ivan's coded harmonica signal and the desperate radio calls, smashed into the German lines. The enemy, caught between 2 forces, fled in panic. The outpost was liberated. Ivan staggered into the daylight, leading the wounded from the cellar. The rescuers stared in disbelief. "How did you survive?" Ivan just smiled, leaning on his axe. "We had soup, and we had hope." The story spread quickly. The cook who saved the outpost, who fought with pots and pans, who kept hope alive when all seemed lost. Ivan was decorated, celebrated, and finally seen. But for him, the greatest reward was simple: seeing his friends alive, the outpost standing, and knowing that even the smallest, most overlooked person could change the course of a war. The dawn broke over the battered outpost, casting long shadows across the mud and rubble. Even Sereda sat on a broken crate outside the mess tent, his hands still trembling from the night's battle. The acrid smell of smoke and burnt wood lingered in the air, mingling with the scent of damp earth and spilled stew. The soldiers were exhausted but alive. The wounded were tended to, the dead mourned, and the camp slowly began to stir with cautious hope. Ivan's legend had grown overnight, from the quiet cook to the man who had held the line with nothing but an axe and sheer will. But the war was far from over. The morning brought a somber mood. The outpost commander, Major Petrov, called a meeting in the command tent. The losses were heavy: men who had fought bravely, some who would never return home. Petrov's voice was steady but heavy with grief. "We held the line," he said, "but the enemy will not stop. They will come again, stronger and more determined. We must be ready." Ivan listened, feeling the weight of responsibility settle deeper. He was no longer just the cook. He was a symbol of resilience, a beacon for the men who looked to him for strength. The days that followed were a relentless cycle of preparation and vigilance. Ivan found himself moving between the kitchen and the front lines, his presence a steadying force for the men. He organized ration distributions, ensured the wounded were cared for, and kept the fires burning bright. The outpost was a fortress of determination, but the enemy's shadow loomed ever larger. Scouts brought news of new weapons, increased patrols, and the enemy's intent to crush the resistance once and for all. Ivan's legend grew, but so did the weight of expectation. He was no longer just a cook. He was a leader, a symbol, a man who had defied the odds. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ivan gathered the men around the fire. "We face death and come back," he said, voice steady. "But the fight isn't over. We must be ready to stand again, together." The men nodded, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. They were tired, scared, but unbroken. The enemy was cunning. They began to use the forest to their advantage, launching surprise attacks under the cover of darkness. The outposts' defenses were stretched thin, and the men grew weary. Ivan worked tirelessly, training the cooks and mechanics to defend themselves, teaching them to use whatever they had as weapons. He organized patrols, set traps, and kept the men's spirits high with stories and songs. One night, the enemy launched a fierce assault. The outpost was engulfed in flames and gunfire. Ivan fought alongside the soldiers, his axe swinging, his voice shouting orders and encouragement. The battle was brutal. The defenders were pushed to their limits, but they held the line. Ivan's courage inspired them to fight harder, to stand taller. As the first light of dawn broke, the enemy retreated, leaving behind a battered but unbroken outpost. Reinforcements arrived, bringing fresh hope and supplies. Ivan stood among the men, exhausted but proud. They had survived, and they would fight on. The outpost was scarred but unbroken. The men worked tirelessly to repair the damage-patching walls, reinforcing defenses and tending to the wounded. Ivan was at the heart of it all, his hands steady as he cooked meals that nourished both body and spirit. The soldiers looked to him not just for food, but for hope. His laughter, his stories, and his unwavering courage became a balm for weary souls. But the enemy was relentless. Intelligence reports warned of a larger force gathering beyond the forest, preparing for a siege that could crush the outpost once. And for all that, Ivan knew the coming days would test them like never before. He trained the men in guerrilla tactics, improvised weapons, and the art of survival. He taught them to fight not just with guns, but with their hearts. The enemy attacked with fury, their numbers overwhelming. The outpost was engulfed in fire and smoke, the air thick with the roar of battle. Odd even fought alongside the soldiers, his axe swinging, his voice shouting orders and encouragement. The kitchen became a fortress, a last stand where courage and desperation met. As the battle raged, Ivan's quick thinking and fierce determination turned the tide. Using the resources at hand, he set traps, created diversions, and rallied the defenders. The enemy, caught off guard by the cook's ingenuity, faltered and retreated. The outpost survived, but the cost was high. Ivan mourned the fallen, honored their sacrifice, and vowed to keep fighting. Ivan felt the weight of leadership pressing down on him. He was no longer just a cook. He was a symbol, a beacon for the men who looked to him for strength. The responsibility was immense, but he carried it with quiet determination. He spent long nights planning defenses, coordinating with officers, and ensuring the men were fed and ready. His kitchen became a command center of sorts, where strategy and sustenance met. The hardships forged unbreakable bonds among the defenders. Ivan found himself surrounded by men who had once ignored him, now standing shoulder to shoulder in the fight for survival. They shared stories, fears and hopes around the fire, their laughter a fragile shield against the horrors of war. The enemy launched their final assault under the cover of darkness. The outpost was battered, but the defenders were ready. Ivan led a group of cooks and mechanics in a daring counterattack, using improvised weapons and guerrilla tactics to disrupt the enemy's advance. The battle was fierce and chaotic, but Ivan's courage inspired the men to hold the line. As the first light of dawn broke, the enemy retreated, leaving behind a battered but unbroken outpost. Ivan stood among the men, exhausted but proud. They had survived, and they would fight on. The outpost slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. The wounded healed, the defenses were strengthened, and the men found moments of peace amid the chaos. Ivan continued to serve, not just as a cook, but as a leader and a symbol of hope. His story was told and retold, inspiring others to find courage in unexpected places. Years later, long after the war had ended, Ivan's name was remembered, not just as the cook who saved the outpost, but as a hero who showed that bravery comes in many forms. His story was a reminder that sometimes the greatest strength lies in the quietest hearts. The days after the siege were a blur of exhaustion and determination. Even Sereda moved through the battered outpost like a man possessed, his hands steady despite the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. The men looked to him not just for food, but for hope, for strength, for a reason to keep fighting. The war was far from over. Scouts brought news of enemy reinforcements massing beyond the forest, their numbers growing, their weapons deadlier. The outpost was a beacon of resistance, and the enemy was determined to snuff it out. Ivan found himself training the new recruits, teaching them not just how to hold a rifle, but how to survive, how to fight with whatever they had. He showed them how to use the terrain, how to move silently, how to keep their spirits alive with song and story. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ivan gathered the men around the fire. His voice was steady, his eyes bright despite the fatigue. "We face death and come back," he said. "But the fight isn't over. We must be ready to stand again, together." The men nodded, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. They were tired, scared, but unbroken. The enemy adapted quickly. They began launching night raids, using the cover of darkness to strike at the outpost's weak points. The defenders were stretched thin, their nerves frayed. Ivan worked tirelessly, organizing patrols, setting traps, and keeping the men's spirits high. He taught them to fight not just with guns, but with their hearts. One night, the enemy launched a fierce assault. The outpost was engulfed in flames and gunfire. Ivan fought alongside the soldiers, his axe swinging, his voice shouting orders and encouragement. The battle was brutal. The defenders were pushed to their limits, but they held the line. Ivan's courage inspired them to fight harder, to stand taller. As the first light of dawn broke, the enemy retreated, leaving behind a battered but unbroken outpost. Reinforcements arrived, bringing fresh hope and supplies. Ivan stood among the men, exhausted but proud. They had survived, and they would fight on. The outposts were scarred but unbroken. The men worked tirelessly to repair the damage, patching walls, reinforcing defenses, and tending to the wounded. Ivan was at the heart of it all, his hands steady as he cooked meals that nourished both body and spirit. The soldiers looked to him not just for food, but for hope. His laughter, his stories, and his unwavering courage became a balm for weary souls. But the enemy was relentless. Intelligence reports warned of a larger force gathering beyond the forest, preparing for a siege that could crush the outpost once and for all. Ivan knew the coming days would test him like never before. He trained the men in guerrilla tactics, improvised weapons, and the art of survival. He taught them to fight not just with guns, but with their hearts. The enemy attacked with fury, their numbers overwhelming. The outpost was engulfed in fire and smoke, the air thick with the roar of battle. Ivan fought alongside the soldiers, his axe swinging, his voice shouting orders and encouragement. The kitchen became a fortress, a last stand where courage and desperation met. As the battle raged, Ivan's quick thinking and fierce determination turned the tide. Using the resources at hand, he set traps, created diversions, and rallied the defenders. The enemy, caught off guard by the cook's ingenuity, faltered and retreated. The outpost survived, but the cost was high. Ivan mourned the fallen, honored their sacrifice, and vowed to keep fighting. Ivan felt the weight of leadership pressing down on him. He was no longer just a cook. He was a symbol, a beacon for the men who looked to him for strength. The responsibility was immense, but he carried it with quiet determination. He spent long nights planning defenses, coordinating with officers, and ensuring the men were fed and ready. His kitchen became a command center of sorts, where strategy and sustenance met. The hardships forged unbreakable bonds among the defenders. He even found himself surrounded by men who had once ignored him, now standing shoulder to shoulder in the fight for survival. They shared stories, fears, and hopes around the fire, their laughter a fragile shield against the horrors of war. The enemy launched their final assault under the cover of darkness. The outpost was battered, but the defenders were ready. Ivan led a group of cooks and mechanics in a daring counterattack, using improvised weapons and guerrilla tactics to disrupt the enemy's advance. The battle was fierce and chaotic, but Ivan's courage inspired the men to hold the line. As the first light of dawn broke, the enemy retreated, leaving behind a battered but unbroken outpost. Ivan stood among the men, exhausted but proud. They had survived, and they would fight on. The outpost slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. The wounded healed, the defenses were strengthened, and the men found moments of peace amid the chaos. Ivan continued to serve, not just as a cook, but as a leader and a symbol of hope. His story was told and retold, inspiring others to find courage in unexpected places. Years later, long after the war had ended, Ivan's name was remembered, not just as the cook who saved the outpost, but as a hero who showed that bravery comes in many forms. His story was a reminder that sometimes the greatest strength lies in the quietest hearts. The first snow fell early that year, blanketing the battered outpost in a hush that felt almost sacred. Even Sereda stood at the edge of the camp, breath curling in the icy air, watching the forest for any sign of movement. The enemy had not attacked in weeks, but the silence was uneasy. A pause, not a peace. The men moved quietly now, their faces gaunt, uniforms patched and threadbare. The outpost had survived every assault, every siege, but the price was written in the lines around their eyes and the empty spaces at the mess table. Ivan felt the weight of each loss, each name he remembered, and each face he could not forget. Supplies dwindled as winter deepened. The roads were impassable, convoys delayed by snow and enemy patrols. Ivan rationed every crumb, stretching flour and beans into thin soup, trading stories and laughter for second helpings. He scoured the woods for wild herbs, melted snow for water, and taught the men to find hope in the smallest comforts: a hot drink, a shared joke, a memory of home. The sick bay was full. Ivan visited every day, bringing broth and quiet words, mending uniforms and holding hands through the fevered nights. He watched over the wounded as if they were family, refusing to let despair take root. In January, scouts brought grim news. The enemy was regrouping for one last offensive, determined to crush the outpost before spring. The men prepared in silence, reinforcing barricades, checking weapons, and saying their goodbyes in the dark. Major Petrov, now gaunt and gray, called Ivan to his office. "We may not survive this, Sereda. If the line breaks, I want you to lead the wounded and the cooks through the old forest trail. Get them out. You're the only one they'll follow." Ivan shook his head. "I won't leave you, sir. We stand together." Petrov smiled, weary but proud. "You've done more than any officer here. If this is our last stand, I'm glad you're with us." The attack came at dawn, the enemy pouring from the trees in numbers the defenders had never seen. Artillery thundered, tanks crashed through the snow, and the sky turned black with smoke. Ivan fought at the barricades, his axe flashing, his voice rising above the chaos. He rallied the cooks and mechanics, led counterattacks with boiling water and burning oil, and dragged the wounded to safety again and again. The line buckled, then held. The men fought with the desperation of those who had nothing left to lose. Ivan moved through the battle like a force of nature patching wounds, swinging his axe, shouting encouragement, and refusing to fall. By nightfall, the outpost was a ruin. Fires smoldered, the air thick with cries and the stench of blood. The defenders were down to their last handful of bullets, their last bandages, their last hope. The enemy breached the outer wall. Ivan led the last defenders in a desperate stand at the kitchen, the place where the legend had begun. He fought with everything he had: pots, knives, his bare hands, until the enemy faltered, then broke. Reinforcements arrived at dawn, smashing through the enemy lines and lifting the siege. The survivors staggered from the ruins, blinking in the pale sunlight, too exhausted to cheer. The outpost had held, but at a terrible cost. Ivan moved among the wounded, his hands gentle, his heart heavy. He buried his friends, marked their graves with stones, and wept for every soul he could not save. He found Major Petrov alive, wounded but smiling. "You did it, Ivan. You saved us all." Ivan shook his head, tears freezing on his cheeks. "We saved each other." As spring thawed the snow, word of the outpost's survival spread. Ivan's name became a symbol, not just of courage, but of kindness, ingenuity, and the power of one person to make a difference. New recruits arrived, eager to meet the legendary cook. Ivan taught them, as he always had, how to fight, how to survive, how to care for one another. He told them stories of the friends he had lost, the battles they had won, and the meals that had kept hope alive. When the war finally ended, Ivan wrote one last letter to his mother. He told her of the outpost, the men he had called brothers, the battles they had fought, and the peace they had won. He promised to come home, to cook her borscht in a kitchen filled with laughter and light. He signed the letter simply, "I was just a cook, but I did what I could." The war had finally ended, but the scars it left on the outpost and its people were deep and lasting. Even Sereda stood at the edge of the camp, now quiet and peaceful under the soft glow of the morning sun. The snow had melted, replaced by the fresh green of spring, but the memories of the long winter and the brutal battles remained etched in every face and every stone. Ivan looked around at the men and women who had survived, the cooks, the mechanics, the soldiers, and the medics. They were no longer just comrades. They were family forged in fire and hardship. The outpost was battered but unbroken, a testament to their resilience and courage. The camp's commander, Major Petrov, approached Ivan with a tired but genuine smile. "You did more than cook meals, Ivan. You kept us alive in ways no one expected." Ivan shrugged, a humble smile tugging at his lips. "I just did what anyone would do." But everyone knew the truth. Ivan had been the heart of the outpost, the quiet strength that held them together when all seemed lost. The days after the war were filled with rebuilding and remembrance. The men and women worked tirelessly to repair the damage, tend to the wounded, and honor the fallen. Ivan continued to serve, not just as a cook, but as a leader and a symbol of hope. Letters arrived from families thanking him for his courage and kindness. Stories of his bravery spread beyond the outpost, inspiring others to find strength in unexpected places. Ivan often found himself sitting by the fire, sharing stories with new recruits, teaching them not just how to survive, but how to care for one another. He told them, bravery isn't just about fighting. Sometimes it's about feeding hope, one meal at a time. Though Ivan's deeds were celebrated, he remained humble. He preferred the quiet moments, the laughter of children playing, the smell of fresh bread baking, the simple joy of a hot meal shared among friends. One evening, as the sun set over the peaceful camp, Ivan sat alone, sharpening his axe. A young soldier approached, eyes wide with admiration. "Comrade Ivan," he said softly, "how did you find the strength to fight when you were just a cook?" Ivan looked up, his eyes reflecting the fading light. "Strength comes from the heart, from the people you fight for. I fought because I believed in all of you, and because sometimes the smallest flame can light the darkest night. Davin's story is a reminder that heroism comes in many forms. It's not always the soldier on the front lines or the general giving orders. Sometimes it's the cook in the kitchen, the quiet soul who refuses to give up, who finds courage in the face of fear. If you've ever felt overlooked or underestimated, remember even Sereda. Remember that your strength, your kindness, and your courage can change the course of history. If this story inspired you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, hit subscribe and join us for the next chapter, because the next hero could be you.